God, may our hearts be opened, our minds renewed, and may peace come to us in this season of peace. Amen. I remember the name Jamal Khashoggi. He was the fearless Saudi Arabian journalist who was also a fierce critic of the Saudi monarchy. And because he received death threats, remember, he left Saudi Arabia, moved to the U.S., and took a job with the Washington Post, a newspaper with a stellar reputation for speaking truth to power. He was based in Turkey and needed some legal papers necessary to get married. That was on October 2nd, 2018. And we remember that moments after his entering the Saudi government building he went to in order to fetch his paperwork, he was brutally murdered. He was not the only journalist so targeted in 2018. At least 27 and maybe as many as 45 other journalists were similarly targeted and killed that year. Many of those were in Mexico and Russia. Those who were murdered in Mexico often died at the hands of drug cartels, while those murdered in Russia were killed on orders of Vladimir Putin. The number of murdered journalists continues to rise around this world. John the Baptist was not a journalist, but he was, in some ways, an ancient world's version of a journalist. He was a prophet, and as a prophet, his job was to expose the truth to a world where lying was an art form. Oftentimes, he was talking to the head of the government about the government and its lies. His particular target was King Herod Antipas. And in the case in point in this morning's text, he was criticizing King Herod about his conjugal life, which was a dangerous thing to do. British journalists, of course, take on the royal family in Britain all the time over their personal affairs, and it's no big deal. The British royal family has no real power, but it took a lot of courage and integrity for Jamal Khashoggi and John the Baptist to criticize the royal families they chose to take on. It's, in fact, what got John arrested and thrown in prison, yes, and as with Jamal Khashoggi, it eventually got him killed. Now, while John was sitting there in prison, he was mightily confused. He was perplexed, as we saw in the text today, about Jesus, because as we saw also in last week's scripture, John had been preaching about the coming of a Messiah. He preached about his confidence that the world was going to end any day, how God was angry with a white-hot anger, and that God's axe was already targeting the root of the tree of humanity, and God was just going to chop it right down. Well, God, he said, was going to separate the grain, that's the good people, from the chaff, the bad people. And God was going to gather the grain into a storehouse and throw the harvest chaff into a massive threshing fire. And then John met Jesus. And Jesus asked to be baptized, which confused John. But he still figured this must be the Messiah. And then when John's put in prison, he hears from his own disciples about Jesus' preaching. And Jesus' preaching sounds nothing like John's. And so John is entirely flummoxed. Jesus' tone is just not sounding dire like John's. Jesus is having dinner parties with tax collectors. He's forgiving adulterers. What kind of Messiah is this? John wonders. So he sends a message through his own disciples to Jesus from jail where he is, asking if Jesus is the Messiah that John and his followers have been looking for, or ought they be looking for somebody else? Well, Jesus hears them out and sends John back this message. He says, "Tell John what you are seeing and hearing from me. The blind are receiving their sight, the lame are walking, the dead are raised, the poor are having the good news preached to them. And blessed is anyone who's not offended by any of this." And that is a very odd answer. I mean, being a healer is no proof of being a Messiah. Both Elijah and Elisha, two prophets in the Old Testament, were said to have accomplished healings, but neither was the Messiah. Jesus' reply also echoes what the prophet Isaiah predicts in a message from God that includes the promise of healing and good news for the hopeless. But it doesn't mention a Messiah in those instances either. So what are we to make of this? Well, I think there's a story that really helps in this regard. It's about an old Amish man from Indiana who was approached by a rather clueless young man one day who was a tourist. And, we all know that tourists flock to northern Indiana to gawk at the Amish and their 19th century carriages and quaint dress. Well, this young tourist asked the Amish gentleman wearing his large straw hat and overalls if he was a Christian. And as I said, the young man was rather clueless. But the Amish gentleman didn't say, "Of course I'm a Christian." No, humble and taking nothing for granted, the gentleman pointed down the road to a nearby house and said, "If you want to know if I'm a Christian, you will have to ask my neighbors." So his point was that being a Christian is more than claiming to be one. It is also more than affirming a set of doctrines. Giving lip service to Christianity means nothing at all. Because Christianity has a lot more to do with what we do than what we say. Because what we do is a better reflection than what we say when it comes to the state of our heart as it relates to God. So what am I getting at here? Well, in a similar way, Jesus could have claimed to be the Messiah. Many would have taken that as enough. But Jesus knew what the Amish farmer knew, that being a Messiah is way more than a thing to be claimed. I mean, anyone can claim to be the Messiah. People do it every day. They preach on street corners or post things on social media to that effect. Words are cheap. The only real evidence of who the Messiah might be requires that we look at what they are doing and see if they are really embodying the healing and genuinely redemptive energy of God. Today, there's a healthy discussion going on about something called wokeness. Wokeness. Many people on the political left claim to be woke. For many, it is a badge of righteousness. Maybe instead of claiming it, people should borrow from the Amish gentleman's humility and say, "If you want to know if I'm woke, ask my neighbor." Or maybe one can say simply, "I do my best to keep watch over my tendency to lapse into racist thinking." Some claim wokeness and use it as a license to call other people racist. And that just seems to me to be a little bit twisted, a little backward. I mean, look, countering racism is not a one and done thing, right? It is a constant battle, and the front line of that war is in the middle of every one of our own hearts. So Jesus is saying to John and his disciples, "You decide if I'm the Messiah. Look at me. Look at what I'm busy doing. Look at the wholeness that people I touch are embodying. Look at the hope the hopeless are receiving from my words. Ask yourself, isn't this the kind of Messiah the world might need? Because the world has had enough of anger and judgment and division, and what good has any of it ever done?" And then Jesus says, if you aren't embarrassed by someone as meek as me, maybe you will want to sign on to being a loving change agent. He is saying, join me, won't you, in changing the world one hopeless heart at a time. There's an old story about a man who went to a wise man and ask, which is the true religion? There are so many. Which is the one that really comes from God? Well, a wise man said the following to the man who was seeking. He said, let me tell you a story. There once was a man who had a magic ring made of gold. Now, whoever wore it would become kind, generous, and full of love. He just couldn't help it. On his deathbed, each of his 3 sons came to him separately to pay their last respects, and each one asked his father if he couldn't be the one to inherit the magic ring. Well, the man took this into consideration, and when he was alone one morning, he sent a message summoning a friend to his bedside who was a jeweler. The jeweler came, and the wise man showed the jeweler the magic ring made of gold and asked him to make 2 exact copies of it. The jeweler embraced the task and accomplished it beautifully. He delivered the 2 rings and the original, and the man who owned the magic gold ring could not tell the original from the other 2 the jeweler had made. In fact, the jeweler confessed that he himself could not tell the difference. He had done such a remarkable job duplicating this thing. Well, the man gave each son of his one of those gold rings, and all 3 thought that they had the original. They didn't know about the other 2. Until they met on the street randomly, and each saw that the other 2 were wearing rings that were identical to his. Well, the man died, and each of his sons was perplexed by this and bothered by it as well. They all wondered who had the magic ring that made the wearer kind and generous and full of love, so they decided to take the case to a judge. Why not? Well, the judge said that as a man of law and not a man of mineral, he couldn't establish which ring was the original, and so he called in several jewelers, but none of them said they could establish which was the original either. The jeweler had done such a magnificent job. And then the judge said, there is one simple way to find out which is the real one. Each of you just continue wearing your ring, and in time it will become clear by your behavior. That is, by your kindness, your generosity, and your love, who it is who has the original magic ring. So the wise man who tells the story then says to the man who wants to know what the true religion is, remember that's where we started, this. He says, the same thing is true of those who were looking for the one true religion, right? It will become clear when you look at what the followers of that faith are doing or not. Now, it's the same with John the Baptist. Jesus, after saying what he says of John the Baptist, tells people that John is a true prophet. John is even more than a true prophet, says Jesus, based on John's integrity and courage and unique mission to prepare the world for the coming Messiah. Then Jesus makes a curious comment about John. He says, truly I tell you, no one born of woman is equal to John the Baptist. Yet, the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than him. Now, what in the world is that about? Does it mean that John the Baptist doesn't make the cut of those who will go to heaven? Well, let's unpack this. In the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus uses the term the least or the least of these, he is always referring to his followers. In fact, it's very possible that in Matthew's own church, the followers of Jesus refer to themselves as the least or the least of these. So instead of being boastful about being Christian, members of Matthew's church were unerringly humble about being followers of Jesus. So taking this term, the least, to mean followers of Jesus, hear this verse again. Truly, I tell you that of those born of women, no one is greater than John the Baptist. Yet the least of these among the followers of Jesus are greater than he. So Jesus is saying that his followers are doing something even greater than John. Because they're following him. Following him. They follow his teachings. John announced the coming of Jesus, but he did not understand Jesus at all, did not really follow him. In fact, he misunderstood him and his mission completely. It was not to bring in the end of the world with fire. Those who follow Jesus are taking another step to bring in the reign of God onto earth that goes beyond anything John had imagined. John's message, while full of courage, was also full of anger and judgment that was unnecessary. Jesus' followers must instead be full of love and forgiveness. So when people ask, is Jesus the Messiah? Jesus would say, look at my followers. See what they're doing if you want an answer to your question. My followers can be identified not by what they say about themselves, but whether they're working to bring healing to the blind and lame, whether they are preaching good news to the poor, feeding the hungry. Note the tone of their words, and it will tell you the state of their hearts. There was a very controversial doctrine that was bandied about during the Protestant Reformation. I'm sure you've heard of it. It's the doctrine of predestination. Presbyterians get tripped up a lot about it. But it was first propounded by St. Augustine in the 4th century based on one verse from Paul's letters. Then it was propounded by Martin Luther. And after that, John Calvin put his own characteristic pragmatic spin on it. In all things, he was pragmatic. So when asked by his own anxious followers how a Christian is to know if he's been predestined to live eternally in heaven or not, Calvin said, look at what you're doing. What are you about? If you're following the dictates of Jesus, if you're living an upright life, if you are, once again, caring for the poor and feeding the hungry and visiting the sick and those in prison, you have no worries at all. You can see by your own behavior that God predestined you for heaven. That kind of positivity was what old John Calvin was after. His followers went down the road with that crazy business of doctrine, but this is where he stopped with it. He saw that so many Christians in his day were so heavenly minded that they were absolutely no earthly good. And he had no interest in it. Again, being part of Christ's kingdom has nothing to do with what we attest to or how we identify ourselves. Anyone can say she's a Christian. The proof is in what we do, whether we truly follow the humble and empathetic heart of Jesus of Nazareth. Finally, in her book, Beyond Belief, the fine biblical interpreter Elaine Pagels details the most important story I know about the beginning of Christianity, how it gained traction when so many other first century spin-offs of Jewish religion did not. What got Christianity up to speed, if you will, was its reputation for exuding a radical kind of love. Pagels also details how that love gradually ceased to be the gravitational center of our faith and was replaced instead by a hierarchical church full of high mucky mucks that put something else above the radical love of the one who founded this thing, Jesus himself. How they put a system of doctrines in place and made that the benchmark, when the teachings of Jesus about visiting the sick should be enough. Pagels details how Christianity went from a religion based on enacting the love of Jesus to becoming a religion based on affirming creedal statements in order to get to heaven. I'm going to give her the last word here. She says, I'm a historian of religion. And so I wondered when and how becoming a Christian became virtually synonymous with accepting a certain set of beliefs. Remember, Pagels argued from the beginning that what attracted people to Christianity and to the church was the remarkable caring that Christians exuded. And so of them she writes, "Those in need could find immediate, practical help almost anywhere in the Roman Empire, where great cities, then as now, were crowded with people struggling to survive. Inhabitants of the vast shanty towns that surrounded those cities tried to survive by begging, stealing, and prostitution. Members of the Christian family contributed money to a fund to support orphans abandoned on the streets and garbage dumps. Christians brought food, medicine, and companionship to prisoners forced to work in mines, banished to prison islands, or held in jail. Such generosity," she said, "attracted crowds of newcomers despite all the risks inherent." She quotes sociologist Rodney Stark, who observed that when the plague struck, and it came back in ancient times too, the only response was to run away, even from members of your own family, he said. But Christians shock their pagan neighbors by staying to care for the sick and the dying, and dying themselves. Why do they do it? Pagels asks. Jews and Christians believe that God, who created humankind, actually loved the human race and evoked love in return. What God requires is that human beings love one another and offer help, especially to the neediest. Well, that focus got lost along the way, brothers and sisters. Sadly, most Christians put adherence to creedal statements above everything else. Everything else. So, that is not just a sad thing, that is our mandate. It is up to the rest of us to take the original love-based faith of Jesus back by what we do and who we love.